Hi, my name is Karen Ellery Jones, and today I have Dave Mason, who is a Director of Public Health, and Rob Steen, who is an engineer with Wright Pierce, and both are members of the Comprehensive Water Resource Management Plan. We're going to talk today about wastewater management, and before everyone shuts off the TV, it is an interesting topic. It's not very technical, but I think what we need to do is kind of talk in a very broad sense about wastewater management, what plans are being formulated for the interim and for the long range. So let me ask some questions right now, very broad ones. Tell me about wastewater and what's the problem? What is it causing in terms of damage to the environment? I do know that I did look at some of the statistics, and Sandwich uses over 1,800,000 gallons of water per day. And you think when you flush your toilet or you run your water, most people think, okay, it runs out of the house and goes somewhere. Where does it go? My septic tank. And then after that, well, who knows? So let's start from there.
Okay. I'll take that first. So backing up a little bit, wastewater on Cape Cod. The problem is that we live in sort of an estuary-based system with estuaries to the south of us and to the north of us that are used to a certain level of nutrient loading. We have, since they were developed, put a whole bunch of people here and have chosen septic systems as our primary form of wastewater management. Septic systems are fine. Title V septic systems are fine for sort of the public health aspects of wastewater, but what they're not good at is nutrient removal. And if you look at those estuaries to the south and to the north of us, they're marine estuaries, and the limiting factor in what causes growth in them is nitrogen. So if all of a sudden we have a number of septic systems that don't remove nitrogen, it goes into the ground and it migrates through the groundwater to these estuaries, you supercharge the estuaries. And you get excessive growth there, which can cause a number of problems, including algae blooms, and oxygen and low oxygen when the algae dies off and rots basically at the bottom of the estuary. So that would be a problem. So Cape Cod, maybe a decade and a half ago, started to really identify this as an issue and it's something that needed to be done. And the state worked with UMass Dartmouth to come up with a program as a way to sort of quantify what is the issue really in these estuaries and how much do towns need to do, versus towns sort of individually struggling with what do we need to do to remove nitrogen. That program has matured to the point now where they're coming out with limits for watersheds for individual estuaries, and those limits are called TMDLs, total maximum daily loads. And all those are saying, look, if we have an estuary, how much nitrogen can safely go into that before we really start affecting that ecosystem? And what they're using as the canary in the mine is eelgrass. They're saying how much nitrogen can go in before eelgrass starts to die. Because when eelgrass starts to die, the estuary starts to change in ways that we don't want to see happen. So throughout this past decade, the towns on Cape Cod have been measuring and doing sampling to find out, all right, how much nitrogen do we have and how much is going into the estuaries. That sampling's gone into UMass Dartmouth, who has a number of modeling programs to model that. They've come out predicting this much. DEP then takes that and says, all right, community X or watershed X, here's your TMDL. This is as much as you can put into the system currently. And because of that, you now have the watersheds are starting to emerge with limits on them. So for instance, Papaneset Bay has a limit where 61% of the nitrogen that currently goes into Papaneset Bay has to be removed, on average across the watershed. How does that connect to Sandwich? Sandwich, like every other community, has watersheds that go to some of these estuaries, whether they're in town or not. Because our water, we're at sort of the top of the lens of groundwater. So everything that we deal with flows down one way or the other.
So our wastewater affects surrounding communities.
Certainly, particularly Barnstable and Mashpee and a little bit of Falmouth, because it flows down to the south and up to the north. Because we're on the top of the mound, literally sort of right about where we're sitting, being at the top of the mound. So we have a stake in these estuaries, even though we don't necessarily share coastline with them. So the town sat down and said, look, as like every other town on the Cape, we need to start to look at how to start to remove our portion of this 61%, for instance, from Papaneset Bay, or 60% from 3 bays, or 100% from Aquoit Bay. How do we start to do that? And in the meantime, we have estuaries that we own, Sandwich Harbor and Squirtin Creek, that will ultimately potentially have limits as well. How do we address those two? The recognized tool to do that is what's called a comprehensive wastewater management plan, or as the town's doing, is a comprehensive water resource management plan, which takes a little bit broader view of it.
So let me just interrupt you for a moment. So prior to this plan, there were no guidelines as far as how much nitrogen being released or measured.
No, the town had done 3 plans previously, but they were all looking at other things.
Okay.
They'd done 2 in the mid-'70s, and 1 in the early '80s, and 1 in the '90s. And at that time, what they were looking at is more what Dave deals with on a day-to-day basis, which is high groundwater, failing septic systems, mounded systems, and they were really looking at town neck in the village, saying, look, what do we need to do down there to try to solve some of these septic issues that are down there, or cesspools at those times? And they came up with a plan. At that time, frankly, for the '81, they had a 90% grant funding available to them from EPA, but the town decided not to move forward on it, principally because they were concerned about what it would do in terms of growth. So they said, we didn't really want to facilitate growth. We feel sewers will facilitate that growth, so we're not going to go forward. So that's kind of where we've come to. And before this effort, there is nothing in Sandwich that says you homeowner need to remove X amount of nitrogen, or you business can't build here because your nitrogen's not in the right way. And part of what the point of this plan is to start to look at that stuff comprehensively and say, okay, what does a town need to do in terms of wastewater? We know we have to deal with this nitrogen issue, but there's other issues we also need to address. The issues that were identified in Town Neck and Sandwich Village haven't gone away.
So they still exist.
They still exist. They just haven't been addressed. You can talk to many of the businesses down there that feel limited by the fact that their septic system is on the edge, need to be replaced often, in a place where they really can't expand the way they'd want to. You may have a restaurant that you really can't have a public bathroom in because you really can't deal with the wastewater flow. Town hall's on a tight tank, so all its flow goes into a tank, doesn't get treated, nothing happens to it until it gets pumped out and taken to a treatment plant, versus maybe your home or my home that has a septic system. So
Are there a lot of tight tanks in the village?
Yes, there's a number of them. The exact amount off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but because of site restrictions, because of the lot size, high groundwater, and those issues, there are a number of tight tanks currently downtown.
Okay.
Which limit also, because if you look at the downtown and people want to enhance the economic viability of the downtown area also, the tight tanks limit the ability to do that.
Right, okay.
So this plan is not only to address nitrogen that we talked about, address some of these tight tank mounted systems, failing system issues. It also needs to look at economic development and say, hey, look, the town is interested in economic development in certain areas versus other areas. How can we facilitate that or discourage that if that's the town's wishes? It needs to look at regionally what's going on. There's a number of communities in the area, south of us particularly, that are ready to move forward with their plans, but they're contingent on what we do because we share watersheds. Until Sandwich understands its needs, it really can't discuss with a Mashpee or a Falmouth what we want to do in relationship with them about those watersheds. So the plan's meant to kind of wrap its arms around all of that stuff, and it's going to take about 3 years to get through it and do that.
Okay, so let's talk about the residential aspect of this plan. Everyone has septic tanks. You've got the tight tanks and septic tanks. What is the homeowner's responsibility toward that? What is the town looking to do?
Well, right now, in the development of this plan, we're still, that will be something we look at, and we'll use the term management strategies as the plan goes forward, and we're looking at the TMDLs, as Rob had mentioned. We'll look at where different residential developments lie in terms of the watersheds they're in, and then we'll make decisions as far as what to do with those developments, the residential developments. It may not be sewering in those areas. There may be other management strategies that are discussed and implemented in those areas. To consider sewering the entire town isn't practical. Should I use the term? It becomes an economic issue at that point also, based on we have the development of the town. We're spread out, so running pipe becomes expensive at that point. So there's a couple different options we'll have to look at in the future. for those residential developments.
Okay, let's just talk about, if we can go back to the septic tank, because I know everyone has one, and they really don't know what goes on in a septic tank and why it's crucial that the wastewater is treated properly. So can you, I know we had a little talk before we started filming about what happens in your septic tank?
Well, essentially, your septic tank, it has two main components. There's the tank itself, and then after the tank's the leach field. So your wastewater comes from your home, flows into the septic tank, and in that it does a couple things. Things that can settle easily will probably settle, but more importantly, there's an ecosystem in there that is consuming a lot of what you think of as the solids coming from your home, and eating that. And that solids, though it may sound distasteful to you, in an ecosystem is food. It's essentially organic carbon, and it is a prime source of food for a lot of communities inside of an ecosystem. So you want to get that out, because if you put that into a river, a stream, or any other water body, it will supercharge that river, stream, etc. The way we call that, and the term you'll hear as we go forward over the next 3 years, is called BOD, biological oxygen demand. And essentially, if you hear that, think of it as food.
Okay.
So your wastewater comes into the tank, it gets consumed, things settle out. If things go in there that aren't supposed to be there, they will settle out.
Settle out, you mean settle down?
Settle down.
Okay.
Grease and such will float to the top, which is why you really shouldn't put grease into your septic tank. And then from there...
Thank you, because my husband's always putting grease in
bad
it.
idea, bad idea. Because ultimately what will happen is your layer will get so thick it will flow out to your leach
Right.
field and kill your leach field. So then it flows, the clear water, quote unquote, then flows from your septic tank out into your leach field, and it helps distribute it into the ground where it goes down into the groundwater.
But still, that's not really treated.
That's not treated. It's done a very decent job at keeping you from it, so it doesn't come to the surface. It's done a decent job at starting to knock down the biological oxygen demand. It's done a decent job of settling out some of the heavier particles. It's done really very little to deal with nitrogen. It's done very little to deal with phosphorus. It's done very little to deal with emerging contaminants concerns, other things of that nature. So it then goes into your leach field and goes into the soil. Well, when it goes into the soil, it eventually works its way down to the groundwater and then migrates to wherever the groundwater is going. If it's going to a southern estuary, it goes to a southern estuary. If it's going to a northern estuary, it goes to a northern estuary. If it goes through a pond, it goes through a pond. And whatever is in it goes there. Title V, as I said, did a wonderful job on some of those first issues, but it's now really struggling with the nutrient portion, which is why something in addition to the septic tank needs to happen.
Okay, what's a Title V?
Well, Title V is the standard septic system that everyone has in their yard, which is comprised of, as Rob was speaking to, the septic tank and
Right.
the leaching facility. So, and as he alluded to, it really does one thing, and that's protecting the public health, and that's separating the public, the individuals from the sewage.
Okay.
Whereas years ago, it used to run in gutters down the street, many years ago. Now it puts it underground to keep that separation, to keep people healthy that way. But it does not address the discharge and what's discharged into the groundwater at that point.
Okay. So I know that when we had spoken before, let's talk about the interim plan.
All right, let me back up a little bit to the main plan. So the main plan is a 3-year plan,
Right.
and it goes in 3 phases. You first identify the needs, and you say, okay, what needs does this community have? You then identify, okay, based on these needs, what kind of things can be done to address those needs, and they come in a number of shapes and sizes and are very different for each community, which is why these plans are never cookie cutter.
And that would be the management strategies.
Those will be management strategies. Those may be cluster systems. They could be things as esoteric as urine diverting toilets. I mean, there's a number of things a community can do to address the nitrogen requirements. That then gets wrapped into a main plan, goes through permitting. So that whole process to get through all those steps takes, 3+ years. When we first started this, the town heard very loud and clearly from certain areas of town that, look, that's not fast enough. We're on the verge of doing some things. We need wastewater solutions now. In the town,
And were these economic?
these are economic
Okay.
areas in town. 2 in particular, the SSVC and the industrial park area principally. So the town said, look, we have a choice. We can either say, sorry, you got to wait. We could tell you to kind of go do your own thing, knowing that whatever your own thing is may or may not be conducive to our bigger plan down the road, and we may have to make up for it. Or we could try to get a little ahead of it and break off some effort and start to do what we're calling an interim plan. which is going to be aligned with the bigger plan, but is on a much faster timeline and looks at a much more limited piece of town. So instead of
Okay.
looking at all of town, it looks at literally two very targeted areas, principally SSVC and the industrial park.
So it's sort of on the fast track.
So I'm very much on the
Okay.
fast.
Yes, and I'd just like to point out at that point, when we had contracted with, when the town of Sandwich had contracted with Wright Pierce for that bigger project, once it was identified this economic issue as far as fast-tracking development of certain commercial properties that Rob had mentioned, we contracted with the town, and the selectmen agreed to contract with Wright Pierce in order to develop this interim plan. So the selectmen have been actually quite active and supportive in the development of this plan for how to handle the wastewater for the commercial developments in these specific areas.
Okay. So what are the type of things that you're doing?
For the interim plan?
Yeah.
What we did initially is we said, okay, look, let's take a look at both areas and not only include the industrial park, but include the land surrounding the industrial park that there may be development in, and say, okay, who would potentially want to contribute to a wastewater solution? Who has a wastewater need, and who has a wastewater need that's immediate, and who has a wastewater need that's maybe secondary, i.e. someone that may be in the area that's not right now thinking about wastewater, but were there a facility in the area, might want to take advantage of it. Because what you don't want to do is build a facility sized for X and then find out you really need 2X.
All right. And this wastewater facility would be a holding tank. Can you explain?
Well, let me explain why we're here
Okay.
first, and then we'll get to there. So when you looked at those areas, there was a couple limitations of what they could do. A lot of, in fact, all of the SSVC is in what's called a Zone 2. Now, a Zone 2 is an area of contribution to a drinking water well. So within a certain amount of time, travel time, whatever you put in the Zone 2 will make its way to a drinking water well, a public drinking water well.
Okay.
There's requirements in the state that you cannot put a new wastewater facility inside Zone 2s. So that pretty much shut out the SSVC from having its own facility on site.
Okay. Got you.
So that kind of killed, bigger Title V systems or bigger individual treatment systems there. In addition, 2 or 3 major watersheds of contribution intersect right at the SSVC, South Sandwich Village Center. And some which already have known nitrogen removal requirements, and some of which are pending nitrogen removal requirements. So if South Sandwich Village Center has a swath of it that's got a 61% removal requirement, that means 61% of the nitrogen that's current needs to come out, 100% of the future nitrogen needs to come out, or you need to do something else. So they were really hamstrung there. The industrial park wasn't as much so. They had the Zone 2 issues, and they also had a watershed with a pending nitrogen requirement, but it didn't look like it was going to be as severe as the South Sandwich Village Center. So the solution was, okay, look, you've got these 2 areas reasonably close together. Is there any place around that you could put a facility and could dispose of wastewater? It's already been basically concluded you're not going to be able to do it on site. You're not going to be able to do it with some smaller on-site type things. You're probably going to need to collect it together and put it somewhere. So that points to a treatment facility. And as we looked around, at the end of Jan Sebastian here, there's a number of properties that the town owns that are ideally located in many ways for a wastewater treatment facility and a disposal facility. So the decision was made, you have a number of options, town, one of which is to put a wastewater treatment facility out there that would serve not only SSVC and the industrial park, but will at least have expansion capability to deal with a number of other issues in the area, depending on if they came to be or not. So the facility that's being looked at out there is more of a traditional wastewater treatment facility. Sewers would go from SSVC in the industrial park, and anything in the area that wanted to contribute to it, they'd go into the plant, it'd go through some screening, possibly some primary settling, be treated, settled again, disinfected, and disposed.
Okay.
Does that
Right
answer
on
your-
site.
On site.
Okay. Is that like the one by Cape Cod Mall? There's the Barnstable. Is that a Is that a wastewater treatment plant?
It is a wastewater treatment plant,
Okay.
and that's what services the Hyannis downtown area
Okay.
and other outlying areas. And residents who pump their septic tanks, that's brought to that location also and treated there.
Okay,
also.
so would it be something like
It'd
like
be,
that?
well, I wouldn't want to associate it directly with that
Okay.
because I know where that will go.
Right,
But yes, basically a treatment plant, not of that size and capacity.
Okay, because that looks like it would treat thousands of,
And
it
that
looks
does
enormous.
take, yes,
It's a bigger facility.
It takes
Right,
care of the
okay.
whole downtown Hyannis area.
And that's
Okay.
part of what the town's working through now. They've gone through the step of saying, look, we want to be ahead of everybody else. We want to make sure we provide some leadership here so we don't get a piecemeal solution. They've then taken the next step in saying, all right, we've estimated what those flows will be. We've estimated a little bit of what the size of this facility will be, but we really now need to talk to the people that would potentially contribute to that facility and see, okay, are you really on board? You know, we're estimating X amount of flow for you. Is that correct? We're estimating that you'd be ready to go in this time period. Is that correct? Are we missing anybody? And start to really wrap their hands around, let's refine this design. It's the traditional design spiral. You start out here and as you refine, you refine, you refine, you get more and more detailed, you refine into a real technical solution. So that's where the town is now. What the plant will exactly be comprised of is still a decision that will be made, and the town will have options. They can use subsurface disposal, they can use surface disposal, they can do a number of other things. The plant can have a number of different technologies in it, and those decisions will be made down the road. But right now, what the town's doing is saying, look, we want to do this, we want to stay ahead of this, we agree that there's value in trying to provide leadership to these different developers. Now how do we make sure that they're all in? And that's the part that we're going for now.
Okay. When this wastewater treatment plant is finally decided upon, who's going to pay for it?
Well, I think that's a policy decision from the selectmen. And there's a
Okay.
number of different options. They were presented to the selectmen at a past selectmen's meeting as a public-private partnership, purely public, purely private. There's a number of different options. And, you know, I wouldn't want to put a finger on it to point to any certain one.
Okay.
And I think that's really a discussion between the selectmen and the developers or the property owners as this process continues forward. Just as we don't know exactly what type of treatment plant it will be, we're not sure of the format of you know, the financing of it either. But that's something that'll be worked out as this process proceeds.
Okay, so we've talked about the interim plan, which basically just looks at the two sites, right? What about the long-range plan?
The bigger plan?
The bigger plan, yeah.
Currently, we are in what needs assessment, that phase one thing, where we say, okay, what are the town's needs? We've looked at a number of different aspects. Dave's exhaustively looked at sort of the aesthetic issues in town and the public health issues in town and the mounded systems and identified, here's all of them in town.
Let me interrupt you for a minute.
Yeah.
The mounded systems, are those the ones that are a mound and
Yeah.
they've got the white tubes?
That, you know, the good example of it is TD Bank North.
Okay,
many
right,
people
yes.
driving on 6A will see, you know, the big mound. They've very nicely decorated it, you know, so it looks nice that way, but it is a huge expense, and it takes up land area too.
Why mound? Why are systems mounded?
The intent of the mound is you're required to have the bottom of your leaching system, which discharges the effluent, to be 5 feet above groundwater.
Okay,
and
got
so
you.
that's to allow a certain amount of filtration to occur prior to the effluent hitting the groundwater.
Okay, so you'll see those in the village?
Yes.
Because of the...
Yes.
They're pretty prevalent in the village.
Okay,
Yes.
got you.
You see a lot of them there. So we've looked at those. We've also sat down with the planning department and said, okay, we want obviously a plan not to just address today, but what is Sandwich going to look like 20 years from now? And we've worked with them in a local comprehensive plan to say, okay, what is build out, and is build out the right number, or is it actually less than build out? And on the time horizons, we're looking at what's the number going to be in terms of number of residences, number of people that potentially are in town, that kind of stuff. So that's gone on. We've also looked at the economic growth in town and said, okay, yes, we're doing the interim solution that deals with these two areas.
Right.
There's other areas, Marina, the Village District, things of that nature. What might need to happen there, or what might change if a wastewater solution is found? We've looked at that. All of that's now being brought together to say, okay, what is the need of Sandwich? What options what do they need to do in terms of wastewater? You talked about at the beginning that initial cut of that's to say, okay, how much water usage is in town? We've talked to the water district and gotten the water records for 2007, 8, and 9, and 10, and said, okay, here's the water records. You know that traditionally 80% to 90% of what you bring into your house for water goes back into your wastewater disposal. If you think about it, from toilets, you drink it, you eventually go to the bathroom, you cook with it, you might throw it down your sink when you're done cooking with it, etc. So 80 to 90% of that will go in. What you lose is lawn watering, things of that nature, car
Right.
washing, that stuff. So we could say roughly we think there's about 1.6 million gallons to 1.7 million gallons of wastewater flow in town now,
That's every day.
every day. Doesn't mean that you're going to deal with all of that. Doesn't mean you're going to treat all that. Doesn't mean anything. Other
Right,
than the
because
fact
some
it's just
you
a data
probably
point.
don't have to, like
Right.
cooking liquids or stuff
Or
like that.
just even, there may be areas of town you don't need to address.
Right.
They're perfectly fine. So we're looking at all those different things and trying to come up with the need. What is the need? That should come to a head starting the beginning of October, because a draft will go to the Water Quality Advisory Committee, which is actually a group we should probably talk about
Yes.
a little bit,
Yep.
who is the steering group for the plan and for the wastewater plan in town. Made up of very specific people from very specific groups that are, there's a Board of Selectmen representative, there's a Concom representative, there's a Planning Board member, there's a Board of Health member, Dave sits on it, and we help advise it, and they're actually steering this. So the draft needs assessment will go to them. They'll crunch on that and work on that and think about that and refine that. It will then go out to the public for public comment, and eventually it'll be finalized to say, okay, we've all come to agreement, this is the need in town. At that point, we can start saying, okay, based on these needs, what are the solutions that are available to us? And that will start the next phase. So right now, we're finishing up needs assessment and about ready to go through the draft process and having people, comment on it and really work with it on a timely basis.
So this is a very complex plan, because you've got so many different areas that need to come together.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it is very complex, and one of the things I want to just reiterate too is the complexity involves the public's knowledge and involvement, and again, those decisions regarding the wastewater future, the wastewater issue and the future of the town of Sandwich isn't being made by Rob and Dave. It is being made by the Water Quality Advisory Committee, which is, as Rob had said, made up of committees that are policy and regulatory driven. And though that board makes those decisions as far as what's occurring and the information we bring forward. So the town is well represented in the decision-making process. And at the same time as this process proceeds, we'll be reaching out to the public in many ways, such as this, to update them, educate them, and at points to receive feedback also.
Okay, super. I'd like to thank you for coming on my show, and hopefully this has, shed some light on wastewater, the problem of it, and maybe, people won't kind of shut off when they hear wastewater, because it's really quite interesting and a critical issue here for Sandwich and the rest of the Cape. So I hope you will come back on.
Happily.
And have some more discussion.
We look forward to
Okay.
it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.